The South African history of ANC and MK in exile in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe and South Africa share more than borders. They share a common history of the struggle against colonialism. Colonized by Cecil John Rhodes through the British South Africa Company (BSAC) in the 1890s, the country was initially ruled by the BSAC. After suppressing the Ndebele and Shona uprisings in 1896, the company established the Southern Rhodesia Order in council in 1898, which in turn established the Legislative Council. Over time, there was growing discontent about BSAC rule, and white settlers began to push for self-government, particularly after World War I. The Legislative Council proposed a referendum to ascertain whether the colony should join the Union of South Africa or set up its own government. On 27 October 1922, a referendum was held which rejected union with South Africa. Subsequently, on 12 September 1923, Southern Rhodesia was declared a crown colony. Black African people were excluded from these processes and dispossessed of land, forced to pay hard tax, and used as cheap labor. In addition, they were denied basic democratic rights and as a result began to mobilize in the 1930s and 1940s, the struggle gathering momentum in the 1950s. African organizations such as the British African National Voice Association were formed in 1947 by Benjamin Burombo and others. In 1957, the Southern Rhodesia African National Congress, SRANC, led by Joshua Nkomo, was founded, but the government banned it in 1959. In its place, the National Democratic Party, NDP, was formed in January 1960. The party demanded one man, one vote, and a constitutional conference with Britain. The NDP was short-lived. It was burnt in the same year it was formed, and in its place the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, was formed. 2 years later, the Rhodesian Front, RF, a right-wing white minority political party, was formed in March, and in December it won the elections. What galvanized the white minority vote against the Rhodesian Party, led by David Butler, was the perception that it adopted a softer approach to increasing African resistance to colonial rule. Perhaps as an attempt to placate the concerns of the white minority, ZAPU was banned in September. Subsequent to this harassment by the government bent on preserving white minority rule, the liberation movement launched an armed struggle, its struggles intersecting with those of the South African liberation movement. A cross-pollination of ideas. While there were local initiatives in the struggle against colonialism and white minority rule in Zimbabwe, leading figures in the anti-colonial movement drew their strength from the South African experience. For instance, Benjamin Burombo, a leading figure in the early struggles of African people in Southern Rhodesia, worked in South Africa and was heavily influenced by Clement Skadalee, leader of the Industrial and Commercial Union, ICU. This pattern of influence also became evident later. Several leaders of the Zimbabwean liberation movement who were without prospects of obtaining higher education in Rhodesia went to study in South Africa in the 1950s, most of them at the University of Port Harcourt. At the institution, they came into contact with the leading figures of the anti-apartheid African National Congress such as Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, and Robert Sobukwe, among others. The 1950s was also the decade of the devious campaign in South Africa, and this gave these students an opportunity to evaluate and draw lessons from the South African experience. In addition, they met students from other African countries such as Julius Nyerere and Kenneth Kaunda. This political exposure and influence was carried back to Southern Rhodesia and gave impetus to the political mobilization of Africans against white minority rule. Black political activists in Southern Rhodesia set up a political party named the Southern Rhodesia African National Congress, SRANC, the name a variant of the ANC. In fact, the party was commonly referred to as the African National Congress. Its members included Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe. When the party was banned, it re-emerged as the NDP, and when the NDP was banned, it reconstituted itself as the People's Caretaker Council, PCC, which later became ZAPU. Cleavages within ZAPU over the approach to the liberation struggle resulted in a split. In 1963, a number of people, among them Robert Mugabe, Edgar Tekere and Ndabaningi Sitole, broke away from ZAPU to form the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, with a military wing called the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA. ZANU was closely aligned to the Pan-African Congress, BSAC, of South Africa and incorporated Africanist elements in its ideology. The two organizations received assistance mainly from China, where they also received guerrilla training. The MK and ZIPRA alliance. While the liberation movements in Zimbabwe were fracturing, white minority rulers in South Africa and Southern Rhodesia fostered cooperation. The apartheid government's support for white minority rule in Southern Rhodesia, particularly for Ian Smith's Rhodesian Front, pushed the liberation movement to cooperate. With persecution increasing within the country, ZAPU launched its armed wing, the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, ZIPRA, and established military bases in Zambia. When the ANC also established itself in exile, it approached ZAPU in the early 1960s for assistance. Given that racial discrimination and denial of political rights to the black majority were common elements in South Africa and Southern Rhodesia, the ANC and ZAPU had a strong sense that they were fighting a common enemy. ZAPU began helping the ANC's Umkhonto weSizwe MK recruits to cross from Botswana through Southern Rhodesia into Zambia and Tanzania, particularly in the early 1960s. Around June 1962, for example, ZAPU's Dumiso Dabengwa helped 32 MK recruits to cross from Bechuanaland into Southern Rhodesia before helping them to cross into Northern Rhodesia. Among the recruits were Eric Mchali, Lennox Mchali, Isaac Makopo, and Lambert Molloy. In 1966, the idea of military alliance between MK and ZIPRA was first mooted with the support of Tanzania and Zambia. Senior ANC leaders Oliver Tambo, Moses Madiba, Duma Nokwe, Moses Kotane, Tennyson Makiwane, and John Brever Marks, Chris Hani was appointed to investigate the possibilities of military cooperation between ZAPU and the ANC. The two movements reached an agreement and a joint military and political high command was formed. Oliver Tambo and James Chikerema, the head of ZAPU in exile, were responsible for political direction, while Joe Modise, MK commander, Akim Dlovu, ZIPRA commander, Archie Sibeko or Zola Zembe, MK chief of operation, Dumiso Dadengwa, ZAPU chief of intelligence, and Walter Mavuso Msimang, MK chief of communications, formed a joint military group. John Dube was tasked with commanding the joint force named Lutuli Detachment in honor of Chief Albert Lutuli. ZAPU was chosen for two basic reasons, ideological and practical. The ANC was ideologically closer to ZAPU as both political formations were aligned to the Soviet Union's brand of communism. In fact, members MK and ZIPRA, the military wing of the ANC and ZAPU, respectively, trained in the Soviet Union and German Democratic Republic, GDR. Furthermore, they had based and safe houses in similar countries such as Angola and Zambia. After Zimbabwe obtained independence in 1980, ZAPU left Angola for Zimbabwe and dominated two military training camps named Kakulama and Kamalundi to MK. It also donated a flat in Luanda to the ANC. The linguistic similarities between Ndebele, Zulu, and Xhosa would also have facilitated communication between MK guerrillas and the local populations. This would have made it easier for guerrillas passing through western parts of Southern Rhodesia to reach the borders of South Africa for infiltration. A number of border towns in Southern Rhodesia shared languages spoken across the borders in South Africa. Stay tuned to the next continuation video. And that's it from Injibs Network. Stay tuned to our celebrity and gossip news.